To you, Professor PLO Lumumba.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start by thanking and appreciating those who have spoken before me. It has been an education in many ways. It's an education in terms of what we ought to do, what we have not done, and I'm of the view that this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas is what Africa needs at this stage. I'm cognizant of the fact that Africa as a continent continues to punch below her weight. She punches below her weight economically. She punches below her weight politically. And she punches her weight below her weight culturally and in many ways. But the period in which we are now has been a period of introspection, one which has allowed us to examine ourselves and to ask ourselves certain foundational and uncomfortable yet necessary questions. One of which is, what is the role of the diaspora out of the African continent? The statistics that I'm going to mention may not be mathematically correct, but they serve my purpose. Right now, as I speak, I believe that there are no less than over 200 million individuals who can claim that they are aboriginally from the African continent. I can make a further claim that that particular population is a population that controls conservatively anything between 1.1 million, 1 trillion and 2 trillion United States dollars. And yet those individuals, as I speak now, contribute very minimally to the continent of Africa. You and me know that Africa, as it is presently constituted, is a continent whose GDP at the very best is about 3.4 trillion United States dollars. In other words, the 55 countries of the continent of Africa have a GDP that is lower than the GDP of Russia, or the GDP of Spain, or the GDP of the Federal Republic of Germany, or the GDP of Brazil. And there is a paradox and an irony at once. A paradox and an irony that commentators, even those with the most jaundiced of views, have said not once, not twice, but times without number, that potentially Africa is the richest continent on earth, so that the Democratic Republic of Congo, as an example, has under her belly resources in the tune of 34 trillion United States dollars. This continent is a continent that is blessed in many ways. If you look at the resources, not only the natural resources, but the human resources, it cannot be gainsaid that if we were to exploit and deploy those resources, the continent of Africa would easily, in the next 20 years, be the richest continent in the world. But that, of course, is in prospect, not in reality. Which then begs the question, what is our Achilles heel? And there have been no shortage of commentators at what our Achilles heel is. Writing in 1983, the great Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe said, with regard to his own country, Nigeria, and which can be extrapolated to the continent of Africa, that the problem of Nigeria, and by extension Africa, is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. In his argument, he will have been talking about political leadership. But one of the things that we must recognize is that political leadership, when it stumbles, then the economy stumbles, then everybody pays. And that is why I think that going forward, we must now ask the foundational and critical question: what is the role of the diaspora? And permit me a little history. Africa has long recognized that unity is critical for development. If one were to read or listen to the early ideas and thoughts of Kwame Nkrumah, for example, in Casablanca, Morocco in 1961, and even earlier in 1958 in Accra, Ghana, he said, if Africa is not united, then she will remain susceptible to manipulation by the erstwhile colonizers, whether those colonizers are the French, whether they are the Spaniards, whether they are the British, whether they are the French, whether they are the Arabs. We will be susceptible to their manipulation. And he was reminding Africans as early as 1958 and 1961 that we must deliberately make efforts to ensure that we unite and exploit our young men and women. And he was using the word young men and women deliberately at that time, because the idea was to tap into that energy and into that enthusiasm. And it is riding on the crest of that enthusiasm that when African leaders, the 32 of them, met for the first time in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on the 24th and the 25th days of May, 1963, that the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah was as passionate as he was eloquent in reminding his audience that every African had to have his or her hands on deck. And he exhorted the audience on that day that we needed to unite and to move as a united front. Of course, nobody listened to him, and we ended up with a weak organization called the Organization of African Unity, which then metamorphosed into the African Union in the year 2001, 2002. But what is critical now, the history notwithstanding, is that throughout the ages, African leaders have always recognized that if we were to realize our potential, then it matters not where we are, whether we are in the mother continent or in the diaspora, what it is that we must do. And many of you will remember, courtesy of history, the activities of Marcus Garvey in those very early days. And beyond Marcus Garvey, you will remember the activities of individuals such as W.B. Du Bois and the many conferences that were held to bring Africans together. And the whole idea was informed by the realization that wherever we are in the world, we must work as a team. And I remember so very vividly and so very passionately the early efforts of individuals in the United States of America and even outside. And there is one speech that comes to my mind. It is the speech that was delivered in 1906 by a South African, Pixley Kaisaka Seme, a speech delivered at the University of Columbia, The Regeneration of Africa. And Pixley Kaisa Kaseme told his audience on that day that if Africa was to realize our potential, it was not only critical but necessary that our sons and daughters, wherever they are geographically located, must work in tandem. And it is important to know that after he had delivered his speech in 1906 as a student, he was one of the pioneers who founded the African National Congress in South Africa in the year 1912. And one can go on and mention great Africans such as George Eman Kwejiragri of Ghana. And why I think that this history is important, because it helps us not only to locate and to situate this conversation. And why should we locate and situate this conversation in a historical context? It is critical because it gives us the ability to identify our true political, geographical, economic, and social true north. And once again, I am convinced that this continent needs our sons and daughters. You who are in the diaspora, and I said at the very outset that you are conservatively 200 million of you, there is a contribution that you can make. The African Union has now recognized you as the 6th region of the continent. Some of our best men and women are diasporic. They are resident in Europe, in America, in Australia, and in Asia. Until now, your affinity to Africa has been romantic and sentimental. But the era of sentimentality and romanticism must now be consigned to the Museum of History. We must now be in the era of practicality and genuine and tangible and discernible and measurable contribution. We are now asking you to ask yourselves, what contributions can you make in the areas that touch our lives, in agriculture, in education, in invention and innovation, in aviation, in pharmaceutics, in medicine, and in other critical areas. I was gladdened last year when it was reported to the world that a Nigerian obstetrician and gynecologist cum surgeon became the first person on the face of the earth to perform a surgery in utero, unprecedented in the whole world. But that was happening in the United States of America, but he is a Nigerian. How could it be if that individual was in Abuja in Nigeria, or in Lagos in Nigeria, or in Bangui in Central African Republic, or in Niamey in Niger, or in Nouakchott in Mauritania? I am now suggesting to you, without fear of contradiction, that I have no doubt in my mind that going forward, we must borrow from other civilizations. You know, and I know, that until 1948, the country that we now know as Israel did not exist. It was by dint of the fiat of the United States of America through the complicity of the British that the State of Israel was created in the month of May 1948. after the dispersal, which was millennial. The Jews have a mantra amongst themselves that a dollar within the Jewish community must never leave the community until it has circulated 100 times. In Africa, we receive the dollar, and within a few minutes, the dollar is flying out. The time is now, courtesy of COVID, which is tragic, but yet there is a terrible beauty about it. The terrible beauty of COVID is that it has allowed us to introspect, to ask uncomfortable questions. And I have no doubt in my mind that we can learn from the Jewish diaspora. Some of you live in the United States of America, the country that you call the land of the free and the home of the brave. That land is a land that gives comfort to all nations and all civilizations. Yet you and me know that the Italian Americans still have affinity to Italy. The Irish Americans have affinity to Ireland. The Irish and all others, the Swedish. Why is it that you of the Negroid, and I'm using the word Negroid very deliberately, not in the sense that it was used in the 1960s, simply to describe our color. Why is it that us, the more distant we are from the mother continent, the safer we feel? The time is now for you to liberate yourself from the chains and shackles of low self-esteem, and to recognize that wherever you are, home is best. You know, for those of you who are spiritually bent, and allow me a little spirituality, particularly you of the Christian extraction, you remember, as it is recorded so very vividly in the Genesis of the Bible, that there is a man called Joseph. And that man, when he was about to be gathered to his fathers, and he knew by dint of divine prognostication that he would die, he said unto his people that when you are free from this land, take my bones and cause it to be buried in my fatherland. You who are out there in the United States of America, in Europe, and other parts of the world, there is a sense in which, speaking metaphorically, you must now come home. And this is the last point that I want to make. That Africa now has structures. I remember so very vividly in 1980, African countries gathered in Lagos, Nigeria, and came up with the Lagos Plan of Action. The Lagos Plan of Action was designed to improve intra-African trade. But even before that, in 1975, under the Lomé Convention, the Lomé Convention was an arrangement between Africa, Pacific, and the European Union to improve trade within Africa. After Lomé Convention went through the course, there was the Cotonou Agreement in the year 2000. And of course, we ended up with the Lagos Plan of Action. The Lagos Plan of Action, nothing happened under the Lagos Plan of Action. After the Lagos Plan of Action, we have had other engagements. We have had the Abuja Agreement, we have had the Yamoussoukro Agreement, we have had the Maputo Agreement, we have had numerous agreements now culminating in Africa Agenda 2063. And Africa Agenda 2063, which is founded on the 7 pillars that you are aware about, which must be read together with the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them. And I want to remind you of the first 2 goals, the elimination of hunger and poverty. And the promises of those instruments have now congealed, as it were, into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which ought to have taken effect actually on the first day of July this year, but has been postponed because of COVID and will now take effect in the month of January. I'm aware that some of the participants here are very intimately involved with AFCFTA. So what can the diaspora do in the context of that history? And I think there are many things that you can do. And I can see that my very good friend, Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao, is present in this assembly, and many others. The African Diaspora Institute, what are we thinking about doing? And I'm saying that going forward, we want you to cast your lot with the continent of Africa, not sentimentally, not romantically, but practically. So we want to see you in the banking sector. You know, about a month ago, when the United States of America, in its usual arrogance, wanted to torpedo the appointment of Dr. Kinumi Adesina as the director of the African Development Bank, I prayed to the gods and they listened. He's now been cleared. Why should the Irish and the Japanese and the Americans invest in the African Development Bank? Why can't the diaspora invest in the African Development Bank? Can we not? Let us go into the area of agriculture. Who is propagating our seeds? It is Monsanto. If somebody is responsible for propagating the seeds that you grow to feed yourselves, are you safe? How have they been genetically manipulated? Can't you invest in agriculture? Can't we invest in pharmaceuticals? Why is it that it is Johnson & Johnson and Roche that we should have in this environment? Can't we invest in that area? We are not now talking about innovation and invention, and we are talking about the 4th industrial revolution and robotics and all other, the Internet of Things and 5G. Why are we talking about Huawei? Why are we not talking about African initiatives? Can't you invest in that area? And there are many areas in which you can invest. If there was ever a time when there was a need to come together, this is the time. And I'll conclude by making reference to a sermon that was delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. just before he died. The last sermon that he delivered in Atlanta, Georgia, at Ebenezer Church. And he reminded his audience about a man called Rip Van Winkle, who history records had slept for 20 years. Rip Van Winkle started sleeping when King George, the King of England, was also the King of the United States of America. When he woke up, he discovered that there had been a revolution, and that revolution had led to the American Declaration of Independence, which you know in 1776, the opening words of which are, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Those words are universally applicable, but the point I wanted to make is what Martin made on that day, that when Rip woke up, George was no more, Washington was. He had slept through a revolution. We Africans, are we going to sleep through a revolution again? Or we are awake that we may earn the dividends that have been brought to us courtesy of COVID-19, which has allowed us to introspect. I have no doubt in my mind that it can be done. And I want to conclude with the words of the man whom I admire, Julius Kambarage Nyerere. He said, "It can be done. Let us play our part." Indeed, it can be done. Let us play our part. The diaspora has a role to play, and a fundamental role. Thank you, and good evening. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor PLO Lumumba, for the education, for the context, and for the clarity that you have offered all of us as we participate in this conference. I can't say enough how much of an honor it is to have your presence and your wisdom representing us throughout this conference. And thank you so much for your remarks. We know that it is getting late in the evening, actually, in Kenya. And so we want to make sure that we release you and respect your time and your contributions. So thank you. We are eternally grateful. And thank you to all of you for hanging in with us as we continue with the